Part 3. Journey to the End of the Earth. Chapter 23. Darkness filled his rear-view mirror. The eastern horizon was gradually brightening, but night still ruled the sky as a whole. At the moment, Kaoru was nothing but a figure making its way through darkness toward the dawn. The few clues he'd found had led him to this mission, this burden, to search out a way to combat the metastatic human cancer virus. All around was blackness, and he had to chase the faintest hint of light. There were few cars on the interstate highway crossing the Mojave Desert at night, so for a long while he didn't need to glance in the rearview mirror. But as signs of dawn began to press in upon him from the front, he checked it more frequently. The sky was definitely escaping night's dominion now, embracing the dawn. The landscape's transformation was beautiful to Kaoru's eyes. The brown earth received the corroding rays of the morning and in turn stained the darkness behind him red. On either side of the highway, mountain ridges began to appear in silhouette. Both hands gripping the handlebars of the XLR, the 600cc off-road bike his father had bought 10 years ago, Kaoru turned his head to see his surroundings. He wanted to savor the landscape racing by with his own eyes, not through a mirror. He'd been dreaming of this desert wasteland since he was 10, and now he'd come all the way to America and ridden 6 hours straight to see it. It had been late yesterday afternoon when he'd picked up the XLR. He'd shipped it to America air freight. Then he'd had to pack for this race across the desert. It had been nearly 10 when he'd finally left L.A. He'd considered getting a good night's rest in a hotel and departing the next morning, but when he contemplated the vast desert to the east of him, he couldn't contain himself. He simply had to set off immediately. But it was dark when he left, and had been dark ever since. Though he'd known he was traversing the Mojave Desert, he might as well have been riding through mountain meadows for all he could see. But all he had to do was point the bike down the highway leading straight into the darkness and keep the handlebars steady. Now the sun was rising, giving him his first glimpse of the land. Kaoru was glad he'd set off when he had, and glad he'd kept going. This change in the landscape was not to be missed. That, and he'd avoided wasting a day. There wasn't much time left. Today was the 1st of September. He had to come up with some sort of conclusion within these 2 months, or it might mean the life of not only Reiko, but her newly conceived child. For 6 hours straight, he'd been submerged within the thick hum and vibrations of the 4-stroke OHC 2-cylinder engine. The road was nicely sealed, but still he maintained perfect riding form, never loosening his knee grip. His father had drilled proper biking technique into him. Whenever he'd lapsed into an unsightly splay-kneed pose, his father would slap his knees and yell at him, "Keep your knees tight around the tank, kiddo." And he had, all the way. Shoulders relaxed, weight nicely balanced on the footrests. Kaoru's father had taken him riding even after his diagnosis. And on those trips especially, his father's words of instruction had sunk deep into his heart. He tried hard to ride with precision. The trip meter showed he'd come 300 miles. The XLR's huge gas tank held 30 liters, good for 350 miles of highway driving, which meant it was about time to fill up. Much farther and he'd risk running out of fuel. This highway had stretches of 200 or more miles with no gas station, so he had to be careful. The luggage rack held a spare polyurethane gas can, but it was empty. He'd meant to stop at a hotel somewhere and lie down on a bed. Now he might have come too far. "I'll stop at the next town and have some breakfast," he told himself. He knew if he didn't force himself to stop, he'd ride his father's bike until it was out of gas. It frustrated him to have to stop. Watching the change from night to day had proven to Kaoru that the world was revolving on its own. He felt that if he stopped, it would go on revolving without him, and he'd be left behind. Just as the last traces of night disappeared from his rearview mirror, leaving the land completely covered with light, a town appeared in the distance ahead. It should have a gas station and a place to eat. Kaoru checked into a motel a little after noon, and then immediately showered and lay down on the bed. He tried to sleep, but the engine vibration had accumulated in his body to the point that his very cells were shaking. He felt itchy and restless. Even as he lay there, his body felt like it was still on the bike. The flesh of his thighs in particular, where he'd been squeezing the gas tank, felt like it wasn't his own. How long was I riding? He counted on his fingers. 6 hours from LA, then he dismounted and waited for the diner to open so he could have breakfast. He'd filled up the tank, then ridden for another 3 hours. Altogether then, he'd been riding for 9 hours. Another 9 hours on Interstate 40 would get him to the vicinity of Albuquerque. His plan was to turn north on Route 25 before Albuquerque, heading through Santa Fe to Los Alamos, and Kenneth Rothman's last known address. Of course, his final destination was the Four Corners region. But before that, he figured it was best to find out what had happened to Rothman, and what his last words meant. Kaoru reached for his rucksack by the bedside and groped around inside it for his billfold, and the 2 photos he should have inside it. He took them out and studied the face they showed him. Still flat on the bed, he held them over his head and spoke to the beloved figure. Needless to say, it didn't answer. Before leaving Japan, Kaoru had visited his father's sick room to tell him he was going to America. He'd explained why he needed to go, and his father had nodded and said, "I see." Kaoru had told his father everything, not even concealing the situation with Reiko. It was possible that his father might die while he was away from Japan. If he was going to tell his father at all, this was the time. Hideyuki had laughed out loud upon learning that he had a grandchild growing within the womb of this woman Reiko. Way to go, kiddo. For a moment, the old, healthy Hideyuki was back, as he asked with an undisguised leer about Reiko's appearance. Is she a good woman? To me, she's the best, Kaoru answered. Can't leave you alone for a minute. Hideyuki trembled happily. Then he spoke earnestly. I'd like to live to see my grandkid. When he heard that, Kaoru was glad he'd told his father about Reiko. He averted his eyes from Reiko's photographs and put them away in the rucksack again. By touch, not rolling over. His heart beat wildly. Just gazing at her seemed to increase his loneliness. To distract himself, he looked around the room without getting up. On one wall hung a garish round tapestry, and from the ceiling hung a fan, blowing lazily. The sound of the fan bothered him less than the noise of the refrigerator in the kitchen. All of the furniture and appliances were old, just like the motel itself. He could hear something, a cockroach maybe, crawling around under the bed. He'd found one on the kitchen floor earlier. Maybe it was the same one. Kaoru disliked cockroaches to an unusual degree. Perhaps because he wasn't used to them. He'd never seen one in their 29th floor condo overlooking the bay. When he checked into this motel, he'd figured on falling asleep as soon as his head hit the pillow. He was that tired. More than the all-night ride, it was the sun beating down on him in the morning that had exhausted him. But unexpectedly, sleep eluded him. Maybe he was too excited. It was his first time in a motel outside of Japan. It wasn't supposed to be like this trip. When he thought of the vacation he dreamed of 10 years ago, the difference nearly brought tears to his eyes. His problems were too many. He had to save his dying father's life. He had to come up with answers for Reiko. He had to prove to his child that the world was worth living in. The child who was now just a cell starting to divide. He listed his goals in order to bolster his courage. He felt excitement, sentimentality, fatigue, vibration, a sense of mission, fear, and heat all wrapped into one sensation. He felt as if an army of ants was crawling around inside his body. If he didn't find a way to calm his heightened emotions, he'd never be able to get to sleep. He suddenly remembered that there was a pool in the courtyard of the U-shaped motel. Maybe a swim would wash off this creepiness. He got up and changed into swim trunks. He dived into the empty pool, and then turned over underwater and looked up at the sky. He loved the feeling of moving suddenly from air to water, from one medium to another. Looking up through the water at the sky, he could enjoy both layers at once. The blazing sun looked warped seen from underwater. He thrust his head above water and stood in the center of the pool. The motel surrounded the pool on 3 sides, but on the 4th he could see the desert stretching out into the distance. Submerged in water as he was even more struck by how parched and unforgiving the land looked. He thought he could feel lumps of heat dissolving inside his body. When the last one had melted away, he got out of the pool and returned to his room. His body was telling him he could finally sleep.